Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining MTF for our second forum devoted to the American Rescue Plan and its implications for Massachusetts. My name is Doug Howgate. I'm the Executive Vice President here at MTF. First, I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning. We were absolutely thrilled with the attendance for our first ARPA Forum back in July. We're even more thrilled with the great turnout we have here today. So MTF, as hopefully all of you know, is an independent, nonprofit research organization. We work on a variety of public policy and public finance issues that relate to the fiscal health of the Commonwealth and the economic opportunity available to all of its residents. And given that role and given our mission, we've undertaken a great deal of work related to the American Rescue Plan. So we publish general information summaries of the bill and related federal guidance. We're providing presentations on the bill to our members, as well as a variety of groups around the state. We've testified and published on guiding principles that should govern spending, and we're hosting a series of public forums to delve into some of the specific aspects of ARPA and what it means for policymakers. So today, we're hosting the second of those forums, where we'll look at the impact of the Great Recession on Massachusetts, as well as the critical role that federal stimulus dollars played in dealing with that crisis and the ensuing recovery. And more importantly, we'll consider what lessons that experience holds for policymakers as they develop their ARPA strategy today. So we're going to start with a presentation to provide some background and frame some points of discussion. But that presentation really serves to set us up for a panel discussion, which will provide key insights from policymakers you all know. And I want to take a minute now to introduce our three panelists that we're very lucky to have here today. So it's fair to say that each of our guests brings a perspective on Massachusetts during the Great Recession and policymaking in the Commonwealth more generally that's pretty tough to beat. Today, we're joined by former Lieutenant Governor Tim Murray. Tim served as the point person for many of the Patrick administration's recovery efforts. Previously Mayor of Worcester, Tim is now President and CEO of the Worcester Regional Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Tim, for joining us. Former Senate President Therese Murray, Senate President from 2007 to 2015, also previously Senate Ways and Means Chair. And Therese is now Senior Advisor at Rasky and the President and CEO of Mass Ignite. And former House Ways and Means Chair Brian Dempsey, who served in that role from 2011 to 2017. And Brian is President of Dempsey, Lucy and Associates. And so thanks to each of you for joining us here today. So before we start our panel discussion, I want to just do that brief presentation. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started on that. So give me 1 second. All right. So we're going to get started now. And I think the first thing we want to talk about here is, why does the Great Recession matter, right? Why are we even talking about this today? And hopefully we'll be able to answer that question in a way that'll lead to the next slides, which is a little bit of background on that Great Recession. What did it mean for Massachusetts? What role did the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act or the federal stimulus play in moving Massachusetts through that crisis? And then how did our panelists, as well as others, manage the budget crisis, as well as the ensuing recovery? Then we're going to spend just a couple minutes framing some key differences between the two crises, because there are major differences that I think are important to acknowledge and discuss, but then really talk about some of the notable similarities, and then some of the lessons to learn that we're going to look at over the next hour or so. So why are we even talking about this? There are clear differences between the Great Recession and the situation we're in now, right? First and foremost, COVID-19 is a public health crisis that has economic impacts and has impacts on a variety of other things in our state and around the world, right? Great Recession, global economic crisis that impacted Massachusetts. So from the start, the kind of catalyzing event of both is different. As you'll also see, the speed of the recovery, defined as kind of the state budget and state revenues, is much different in the two instances. During the Great Recession, we were dealing with revenue shortfalls for years. To date, state tax revenues had kind of an initial blip, and then after that have really recovered quite strongly. And then finally, a key difference is the scope of kind of the federal response, right? I think the federal government learned a great deal from the Great Recession. They acted more quickly. They've done a number of more bills that have been more generous and, as I think you'll hear from the panelists, more flexible, right? So some key lessons learned there. So even though there are those big differences, some of the major key questions for policymakers, I think, are exactly the same. First and foremost, How do you respond to a crisis in the moment while also thinking about what the state needs to look like in a year, 2 years, 3 years, right? There are very few experiences in Massachusetts history where that trade-off is so clear. 2, how do you deal with the fact that these crises, while they impact all of us, affect different populations differently, right? Whether it's individuals, economic sectors, regions of the state. I think that's absolutely true of COVID-19, was absolutely true of the Great Recession. And so how do you adopt a kind of targeted approach in that area? And then 3, and probably most obviously, there aren't that many occasions where we get a boatload of federal money that we have to figure out how to spend sustainably, appropriately, as part of a coordinated strategy. And so looking at the only other time that happened to see how we coordinated activities, what we chose to spend it on, I think is a really important thing to do. And I think you'll see through this presentation, but more importantly through the discussion, a lot of the lessons from the Great Recession have already been learned, and I think there's some more for us to learn in the months ahead. So just very quickly on the Great Recession and the Massachusetts state budget, right? So bottom line, Massachusetts was hit quite hard during a recession in 2001, 2003. By 2007, 2008 was really kind of back on its feet. Unemployment was finally below pre-recession levels. State revenues were strong. State spending was strong. We've done some major bills related to Chapter 70 and things like that. And it took a little while for the subprime lending crisis and some of the other harbingers of the Great Recession to really hit Massachusetts. Through the first 8 months of 2008, state revenues were actually performing quite well, about $700 million above benchmark. In the next 8 months, they declined by $2.3 billion against benchmark. And so this slide demonstrates that, but the reason why I wanted to present this is for 2 reasons. One, it's kind of a mirror image of what we just saw in 2021, right? In 2021, as you were tracking state revenues, every time we thought we had a handle on the fact that revenues were a little stronger than we expected, they exceeded our expectations. 2009 was like that in reverse, right? Every time we thought we had a handle on how bad things were going to be, it got worse. And I think the lesson that budget makers learned last year in terms of pressing pause on the budget was directly attributable to the experience in 2009, where the budget kind of stayed on its normal course. We incorporated some serious cuts into the initial budget, but the fact that we just didn't have a handle on how bad things were going to get, what the feds were going to do, meant that you had to downgrade revenues 5 times in a year period, adopt 4 different rounds of 9C cuts, right? It was this idea that no matter where we thought we were in the process, we had to continue to kind of adjust the budget as we went along. And so the cuts were always going to be bad. But the fact that we had to kind of try to continue to make those adjustments on the fly, I think made some of those, the impact of some of those cuts even more damaging. And so that's, I think, an initial clear lesson we saw. One other thing I just want to point out, because we'll talk about it a little bit, is there can be a big disconnect between the kind of global narrative about where we are in a process and then what the impact is on Massachusetts. So this chart shows employment, labor force in Massachusetts, and the impact of the Great Recession. The black bar you see is when the recession technically ended, according to economists. And I think what you'll realize, and everyone probably remembers, is they may have said the recession ended in mid-2009. From a Massachusetts budget experience, that wasn't what happened, right? We were living with this thing for years after that fact. And so there can be a real disconnect between, I think, the public perception of where we're at in the process and what it means for state finances, program demand, all that kind of stuff. So as much flack as I think ERA got in the years afterwards about not being sufficient, not being flexible enough, it was absolutely critical for Massachusetts and unprecedented, right? An $800 billion piece of legislation to provide myriad supports for states, employers, individuals, really hadn't been done before and was absolutely critical. And it's interesting to look at the things that really predominated in ERA from the Massachusetts perspective: enhanced Medicaid, targeted education spending, infrastructure dollars. All 3 of those things, to some extent, absolutely have a through line to the federal response during COVID, right? They identified some stuff that worked and they continue to do it. So, and here you can see in kind of black and white how important ERA was for balancing the state budget. Over a 3-year period, right? This wasn't just 6 months, 1 year. Over 3 years, ERA was used to buttress 8% of tax revenues. To put that in perspective, that's like $3 billion annually in today's dollars. So this would be the equivalent of about a $9 billion package of federal support now. that was absolutely essential to balancing the state budget. And even with ARA, what I think you heard a lot from groups like MTF and other organizations a year ago was that when things got bad, you had to employ every option available to you to balance the budget, right? So midway through 2009, you're dealing with a $3 billion budget gap, increased demand on state services. So not only did you have to deplete more than half of the rainy day fund, you had to rely on billions in federal stimulus, multiple rounds of 9C cuts, reversions, trust fund sweeps, right? Everything was on the table in addition to the cuts already built into the budget. If we were to do this same chart in 2010, it would be the same list and a major tax increase, right? With the sales tax increase. So this was the kind of lived state experience of when things get bad quickly, you have to employ all of these options just to produce a budget, even though that budget's going to be painful. Now, I will say, and one thing we want to delve into the discussion is the states did some really good stuff during the Great Recession. First and foremost, I think learned at the time some fiscal lessons. The Great Recession was always going to be bad in Massachusetts, right? It was not of our making. But I think there was a recognition that there were some things about the way we budgeted that probably could be improved to mitigate the impact of future crises like COVID-19, right? Dedicating cap gains revenues into reserves, developing a caseload forecasting office in A&F so we could actually have a sense of how mass health and other caseload driven accounts were looking in the months and years to come. For a little while, the state did a very good time with some long-term fiscal planning. And so all three of those were implemented during the Great Recession, as well as a bunch of important policies that were adopted that I think we'll talk about later. And so those improvements, I think, have some really discernible impacts on Massachusetts, right? First and foremost, not a lot of states were getting a bond rating upgrade in the middle of the Great Recession, right? And so that 2011 S&P bond rating upgrade, I think, was a real credit to the coordination between the administration and the legislature, as well as the policies that they adopted during some really tough times. And then the other thing that I think it's important to note is the first time things kind of turned around, end of 2011, we had a little revenue that we weren't anticipating. The decision was made to put the vast majority of that in the stabilization fund, more than doubling the balance of that fund. And I think that was critical. And we saw that as the years after that kind of continued to be rough, that fiscal stewardship of the initial surpluses, I think, was hugely important. So just to conclude a little bit on the Great Recession, I think it's important to note, too, that the effects of that event lingered for years, right? Budget cuts made then, some of which, if you adjust for inflation, we're still living with, right? The reliance on federal money, absolutely essential at the time, created a kind of a negative feedback loop with using the stabilization fund and other one-time resources, even as the economy recovered. And then I think as we implemented some of those fiscal best practices, as times got better, it took a little while to find our rhythm of how we implement those when people want to spend money and there are a lot of resources on the table to kind of continue to have that discipline. And the other point I want to make with the Great Recession is it's really difficult to know where you are in the process when it happens. What I mean by that is FY11, FY12, it kind of looked like we were out of the woods. Revenues were strong, we're rebuilding stabilization fund, we're implementing the Chapter 70 reforms. And then we went through essentially a 5-year period where revenue growth was anemic. We had to continue to use the stabilization fund, continue to make 9C cuts. And I think that was really the impact of the Great Recession that we were just seeing over a longer time horizon, the impact on different regions and things like that. And so that's, I think, a key lesson going forward as well. All right, so just kind of to sum up, clearly these two situations are different, right? A public health crisis and a global recession are different circumstances, right? And a key part of our solution to what we're dealing with now has to focus on public health first. And that wasn't really a primary consideration 10 years ago, right? So that's absolutely different. The budget impact to date, honestly, is a little bit night and day. You saw that chart in 2009 about how bad revenues were, how difficult it was to just put out budgets that got us through today. 2021, so far, FY21, we finished with a significant surplus. FY22 budget was able to make significant investments, and we now have a lot of federal money that we have to figure out how to spend, which leads us to federal support. I think the feds absolutely learned some big lessons from the Great Recession. Their support was more robust, more flexible, and more often, right? And so that is a big difference between the two situations. That said, I get back to these fundamental questions that policymakers like the ones you're about to hear from had to deal with, and the policymakers today have to deal with. How do you use billions in temporary federal revenue to balance the budget, make investments, and do it in a sustainable way? One. Two, how do you deal with a crisis in the moment and know that eventually you're going to be on the other side and you want to try to address some of those issues now in a way that works for everyone? Three, how do you deal with, from both a policy and a political standpoint, crises that don't impact everyone the same way, whether it's different economic sectors, different regions of the state, different individuals, different populations? You know, I'll be interested to hear later on about some of the initiatives started along the same time as the Great Recession, like gateway cities and some of those other things that were about that disparate impact of that crisis. And then I think this idea that it is also an opportunity to make profound and lasting change, whether it's improving some of our fiscal practices, which don't worry, we still have some room for improvement there, or it's other big policy improvements. And I think you can point to a lot of big policy accomplishments during the Great Recession. And I'm sure that policymakers today want to do the same thing. And then it gets to coordination, right? Always a need to coordinate across levels of government, between branches, but that's heightened when people got a lot of money, there's some time deadlines, and you want to be making decisions that all kind of go in the same direction. And so finally, and then I'll stop the presentation and move on to the discussion. Some lessons I would just leave you with from this presentation. We don't know where we are in the trajectory of this crisis, just like we didn't with the Great Recession. And it's important to recognize that in our decision making. Two, it can be easy to put in place improvements now. Follow through can be more challenging. And so coming up with a plan for how we make sure we do the things we say we're going to do in a sustainable way needs to be a part of the process. The decisions you make, whether they're good or bad, cuts back then, investments now, they're going to be with us for a long time. And so that means we have to think through how we're going to, what they mean in the future, what they mean for our future goals. And it's a unique opportunity for lasting change, right? There are some things we did in the Great Recession that I think are still paying major dividends right now. We want to use that same opportunity now. And then a final pitch for MTF. We published a month ago some kind of fiscal principles the state should consider. And I think you really see those during the Great Recession. You got to make sure what we do is sustainable. You got to prioritize what's important. You got to try to figure out what works and what the future holds and then plan accordingly. And you have to coordinate, right? So that was very quick, but probably not quick enough. So let me stop sharing and introduce our panelists again. Thank you all for joining that and putting up with my too long presentation. And let's get to why everyone's actually here, which is to hear from you folks. So want to start at kind of a high level, which is you each were in major policymaking decisions during the Great Recession. As you look at the decisions that policymakers have to make now, what are some of the things you would flag as to do or not to do as they chart a course for kind of a post-pandemic recovery? And Therese Murray, I think I'll start with you if that works.
Well, that's a big question. Before we started this discussion, we had a smaller discussion about wouldn't it be nice if we had that kind of money when we went through the Great Recession. And the similarities, there are lots of similarities, but there's some big differences here. When you say that we were in a global recession, yes, the entire globe was part of it. It was almost a depression, a big depression. But then, and as we climbed out of that, now we're in a public health recession, which is very different. But two things pop out on both for me, and that's what happened to our healthcare system. What is the cost of healthcare, not just here, but nationwide? What is the access to healthcare? Who gets it? Who doesn't? And how do we fix the problems that we had back in the first recession and now? Well, the government then gave us money. We were able to, states who took advantage, like Massachusetts, we got additional Medicaid. We could expand Medicaid coverage. That was a big deal, I think, for us. And you gentlemen can jump in there. This time, it's different. This time, it certainly showed the inequities in the system, in the healthcare system, that we all kind of knew were there. But with this pandemic, the long-term care facilities, the health access for those individuals, as this pandemic swept through, we lost populations in our nursing homes because we didn't have a handle on what was going on. and because we don't pay them enough to hire good help or keep enough help for caring. And I think that's going to be a big problem, I shouldn't say problem, it's a problem, but that's something that has to be addressed first and foremost as you go forward.
Tim or Brian, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think as Madam President said, I mean, certainly what distinguishes this situation is, the pandemic, the health crisis, the healthcare disparities that have been illuminated, for everyone. But, as you were going through your presentation, some of the flashbacks of just really 2.5 years of struggling with the budget and filling holes. You mentioned 4 rounds of 9 seat cuts. I mean, it seemed to me like the movie Groundhog Day, almost every day the budget office preparing a detailed binder for Governor Patrick to go home with, little notations in there about cuts that had to be made through the 9C process. And while you're going through those 9C cuts, you're in the process of preparing for the next year's budget and constantly trying to fill holes. And, I think about the $5.3 billion that the state has received through, the American Rescue Plan Act, we received, I think it was about $7.8 billion through ARA. But as you point out, half of that was very targeted. And there was not a lot of discretion, and where there might have been some discretion, where there was some discretion, it was on that Medicaid funding, but instantly it was to mitigate cuts that were or as best as possible. And the other element of this, which is very different, is that I think we were all very mindful. I know the Senate President, Brian, in his role, is that municipalities, unlike now,
yeah,
with the ARPA, they've got direct money and school systems. That was not the case. So kind of very different in many ways. But there are lessons, as you mentioned, hopefully we'll get into, of how that money can be spent in a way that pays dividends in the long term.
And Doug, I'll just add that I certainly agree with the points made by Madam President and our Lieutenant Governor. And it's interesting. I think the point that you made, which is compelling, is we just don't know where we're at in terms of the trajectory here. And I think, you have to applaud the leadership in both the House, the Senate, and the governor right now, because they're mindful of knowing that. They, when you talk with folks, they say, we don't know where we're at and what the future holds. So we have to be really cautious about how we utilize these funds. And I think they recognize that, look, if there are lessons here, you've got to be very careful with the use of one-time monies. One of the most significant reforms that I think you touched on, and certainly Governor Patrick, Lieutenant Governor, Senate President, we embraced the idea of capping the use of the capital gains, the most volatile source of revenue in the Commonwealth. When you go back, you just have to look at 2004 to 2008, and you saw cap gains go from 869 million to 2.2 billion. And then 2009 came and it went down 1.6 billion. And that just speaks to the volatility. But that was an opportunity, I think, to embrace a significant reform that did 2 things. It allowed us to demonstrate to the bond rating agencies that we want to be prudent in the use of those funds, but we also want to use the excess to replenish the rainy day fund. And I think that was significant, as you point out, with the bond rating, and all of us together, the Senate President, the Lieutenant Governor, the Speaker DeLeo, all of us sitting with the bond rating agencies at the time and having them actually interview you in terms of your spending philosophies, your savings philosophies. All that was compelling. And I think working together, which I think is happening today, they're going to be able to accomplish some very good things with those funds. And I think, again, I'm hearing a lot about infrastructure, a lot about being cautious, and I think that bodes well for us.
So I want to follow up on that a little bit, because I think the point that was just made from Brian about you don't know where you're at in the process, and how do you kind of balance decisions with today with decisions in the long term. Wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about, if you were kind of in those roles today, what are some of the kind of over the horizon challenges, or how would you prepare for this idea that you need to have a plan that works for today, but is also consistent with what's going on in the future?
Well, I would say that to some extent, back in 2007, I think it was, we lifted the bond cap, But part of that was, I think, a strategy. Again, I think as Brian and Senate President have talked about, there was, and it's always there's the negotiations in public and private, but I do think there was a level of collaboration through the crisis, which was several years, but also on taking a new look at some of the fiscal approaches. And so while the bond cap was lifted, prior to and then certainly through the crisis, a whole series of things were put in place. Debt affordability analysis, having every year doing forecasting 5 years out on budgets and debt, all of which were new. And so I think that then enabled us to move forward in 2008, I think on 6 or 7 different bond bills. And we know that when bond bills go out, it doesn't instantaneously inject dollars into the community. It takes a while for supply chains and things to activate. But I do think that, and I remember Governor Patrick saying, consistently, we're going to make decisions that are in the best long-term interest. And there were probably a lot of ribbon cuttings that Brian and Senate President and I were not at on things that, we got rolling with our colleagues in 2008, 2009, and are paying dividends today. So I think we had the higher ed bond bill, which had been decades before one had been passed. You had the life sciences bill, broadband, housing bond bill, and I think there are probably several more. But those kind of get things moving. And I do think, to answer your question, that infrastructure is always a good thing to invest in. And if we're talking about regional disparities and economic disparities and addressing racial inequities, investing in infrastructure is a piece of that, and it's one-time money.
If I could just add on that, you're right, Lieutenant Governor. When you put the trades to work, when you prime the pump by using the bond money and lifting the bond cap, you got all those tradespeople who spend their money when they're working. They spend that money. That money trickles down into revenue for the Commonwealth. And those are the people that we knew were going to be hit the hardest when this hit, because they lost. If you remember, you have 2 people, working families. Both parents worked. They both lost their jobs. They both lost their house. They both lost their car. It was such an enormous immediate impact because of what the banks had done, that we were scrambling at the time and had to continue to cut and cut and cut. But lifting that bond cap, putting people to work through infrastructure improvements, and I think that's what they can be doing today. We certainly have enough of them. We got the places we always hit the first is the environment, because it was easy to reach out and grab that money. You say it doesn't affect people. Well, we know now it does. Climate change affects all of us. But the places we want to cut first, I think we certainly learned that those are the places we need the most. We need a safety net. We need the infrastructure improvements. Those put people to work just like they did in the Great Recession. And I think that we did that in the life sciences. For me, was the biggest. And all you have to do is look out the window today in Boston or any place, or New Bedford, and you see the results of the investment of that.
Doug, the Lieutenant Governor used the word flashbacks. I'm having all these flashbacks now about those budgets. But it's interesting because, even, as you mentioned, the trajectory, 2011, 12, 13, we were still using a little bit of STABE, drawing down. I think 11, it was 200 million. It sort of speaks to, we had this goal of trying to, again, I remember we would show a chart, how much one-time monies we were using. And then it got to a point where, when Governor Baker was elected, things began to improve that way. And they did a great job with Secretary Lepori of sort of drilling down on the actual budget numbers and sort of truing up the numbers. There are oftentimes we would underfund certain accounts, knowing that we would sup it later on.
I think Chairman Dempsey.
Right. and the secretary did a great job of making that a priority. But I do want to mention that just we were fortunate when this all began, that we had 2.2 billion in a rainy day fund, and I want to give Speaker Finneran a lot of credit for sort of initiating and prioritizing that and sort of putting us in that position. But I think this also allowed for us, and I think it allows for leaders today to look at opportunities for reform. Senate President, Lieutenant Governor, Speaker DeLeo led on this municipal health reform happened and could not have happened or would not have happened were it not for this crisis. And the only way that happened, I remember, chatting with members and showing them, here's the increase that we've seen in Chapter 70. But here's the percentage of that increase that's going to pay for health insurance. So, members got that and recognized that it was time to, make some significant changes around that. Mass taxpayers led on that and was part of sort of the outside game to convince folks to do that. And as a result of that, cities and towns saw a savings of over $250 million. So, you also look for those opportunities, and I think they'll do the same. There are opportunities, particularly with this use of one-time funding.
And just to drill into that for a second, because Madam President, you mentioned the Life Sciences Center. Chairman Dempsey, you mentioned municipal reform. You could look at gaming to some extent, right? Where these really pretty major policy pieces that are still a huge part of the state revenues, a huge part of state reforms. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how to what extent was that approach about what we wanted to do that day? We needed to get some new revenue. We need to provide some relief to municipalities or get some additional revenue in the door with the state. And to what extent was it this is where we want Massachusetts to be in 5 or 10 years. And so let's try to advance some of those priorities now, given some of those great examples I think you've all named.
I'll just jump on the gaming piece, if you like, Doug. I think that was one in which, and I think this is often lost sometimes in the conversation, which is, was creating an industry, and it didn't cost the Commonwealth anything to create that industry. You can look at the great work that the Lieutenant Governor and the Senate President and Governor Patrick did around life sciences, and has paid dividends beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And that required an investment. Creating a new industry around gaming really didn't require an investment on the part of the Commonwealth. In fact, it allowed us to capture millions and millions of dollars, create new jobs, permanent as well as construction. And it was a way to do something that, again, allowed for us to be thoughtful in our approach to at least getting some additional recurring revenue, which is the key.
And I would just say, both the life sciences and gaming, the 3 words we tried to focus on were education, innovation, and infrastructure. And, Governor Patrick talking about the life sciences and that playing on 2 of Massachusetts' strongest calling cards, which is our healthcare, which is known worldwide, as well as our higher ed system, and how the life sciences and biotech was really a blending of those 2 and creating a new emerging sector. And like as Madam President said, whether it's Worcester and Central Mass or the greater Boston area, that cluster is growing immensely. And that took strategic thought and investment that paid dividends over time. On the gaming piece, there were some great stops and starts on that, as I'm sure both the Senate President and Chairman Dempsey remember. But clearly,
well said, Lieutenant Governor.
but clearly there was a game, and the discussions in the governor's office were about revenue. We knew we were losing revenue to other states, and that was an opportunity to create jobs in the construction industry, recapture some of that revenue so that we would then have it to fill holes and do things. And, there's great pros and cons and debates about, even to this day, about, the merits of gaming and did we put enough protections in, but the revenue was clearly a piece of that, a big part of that decision.
And now this present legislature has sports gaming in front of them as another opportunity to grab some revenue, but that's a little bit more involved than just putting in gaming, which was, as you know, we had lots of people on both sides of that issue who were very passionate about whether we should do it or we should not do it.
And I think that really it highlights in each of those areas, and again, municipal health reform to me is a great one as well, of the kind of this intersection between the crisis of the moment, but also putting in place policies that hopefully work going forward. And just curious to unpack that a little bit, especially on the life sciences side, are there places you see now that, whether it's an area that would require significant state investment or an area where maybe we just have to create a regulatory structure to allow it to work, are there any areas that you 3 would highlight as kind of the next Mass Life Sciences Center that maybe folks should be thinking about as they think about these flexible dollars, or maybe it's regional investment?
I would say cybersecurity is the big one, and we're starting to bring some of those firms into Massachusetts. We just brought one in from Rhode Island to Fall River, and because we have an educated workforce here, they want to be here, and this is we're seeing this on a daily basis, no matter whether it's your own personal account or your company or your school or your municipality. That I think is going to be the next big push for our economy in Massachusetts.
I would say I still think I would agree on the cybersecurity piece, but still think a lot of runway and opportunity for us to continue to grow the life sciences and biotech and all aspects of the clean energy side. But how do we do it in a way that more parts of the state can participate? And so that is where an issue like East-West Rail is important, because Springfield has got some of the healthcare and higher ed pieces there. But how do you cross-pollinate that success that's in Greater Boston and expanding in Central Mass to other parts of the Commonwealth? And transportation is a piece of that. And can you use some of these one-time dollars, to address that? Doug, there's one piece that I did want to mention. Brian had talked about the municipal healthcare, but if there's one thing this pandemic has showed us and continues, is that these problems don't begin and end around city and town boundaries. And collectively working with the legislature, we were able to put some money to incentivize municipalities to look at the regionalization of services and healthcare, veteran services. I remember at the time, Massachusetts is close to Maryland in terms of population and geographic size. They had, I think, 20 or 30 public safety answering points, 911 calling centers, whereas Massachusetts, I think we had like 270. So working with the legislature, we put some money out there to incentivize them to look at regionalization and then provide equipment to do that. I think there's a huge opportunity to continue to look at that, to find savings, but also to better protect from a health, financial, cybersecurity. And so we should continue to kind of encourage and look at ways to facilitate municipalities working together.
Yeah, in the one area I think is another good example, Doug, is the work regarding offshore wind. Again, trying to create an industry here in the Commonwealth. Certainly Speaker Mariano, Pat Haddad, Tom Golden, so many others, Senator Barrett, Senator Pacheco have led on this issue, and it's a way in which, again, it's another example of creating the incentives for an industry to develop, and we've already seen some of the benefits to that. And I think it's continuing to look for those other opportunities. And just, the Lieutenant Governor has me thinking now of, as they continue to look out at the future and what do you do with these funds, I think a couple points. One is, wisely, they've all agreed to replenish the STAVE fund, which is significant, and we see that. Senate President Spilker, remember in conference committees, always prioritizing this. Mike Rodricks and Aaron Michaelwitz very, very strongly about it as well. But, I wonder, as I look at both the Senate President and the Lieutenant Governor, and Doug, you and I have talked about this, I wonder if we could take back advancing the pension payments as we did for a number of years, or putting that money into the STAVE account. I wonder if we would do it differently, because I think we were trying to do everything. We were trying to replenish STAVE, and then we saw an opportunity. I remember talking with then Secretary Jay Gonzalez about this. We looked at New Jersey and Illinois. We said, look, their bond rating continues to decline, and they keep talking about unfunded pension liabilities. So we said, let's accelerate our pension schedule. And we dropped it by 4 years. That meant $200 million. So just for example, if our revenues went up by $800 million, which was sort of the number back then, right off the top came $200 million. And we were paying down our pension. And, we'd always ask the question, well, should we be doing that, or should we take the 200 and put it into the STAVE account? And I think we got the answer in 2017 when one of the bond rating agencies dropped us a bit and said, you should have more in STAVE. And I remember Governor Baker, Speaker DeLeo, Senate President Spilker all saying the same thing. So wait a minute, we put a bunch of money into the pension. You were trying to pay attention to everything. And I think, what I would say to our friends today is pay more attention to the rainy day fund, the stabilization fund, as they are, to their credit, because I think at the end of the day, the bond rating agencies, put more, put more value in that, if you will.
Well, and fascinating you mentioned that, and it leads me to the next question, Chairman Dempsey, which is you could look at kind of the fiscal good government stuff that the state did during the Great Recession. As you said, did a bunch of stuff, right? So cap gains to reserves, that was a big thing. Municipal finance didn't have a direct savings to the state, but certainly had an indirect savings and a major municipal savings. You had advancing the pension schedule. So I'd ask you to answer this in kind of two ways, which is one, how challenging was it working with your colleagues in the House and the Senate to kind of convince people to do stuff during really tough times when you had to cut the budget where money may be going to the pension fund or the state fund and not to restoring a cut? And then two, I think at the point you make about figuring out what good government's kind of financial improvement to make and then really hitting that hard is a great one, right? Because there was some stuff that I think has really paid dividends for Massachusetts and some things that in hindsight probably weren't kind of the maybe we would have done it differently.
I have to say that members have always been very good as long as you're giving them the rationale, and I go back again to Muni Health and say, look, yeah, we're putting a ton of money into Chapter 70, but if a lot of that or a significant percentage is going to pay health insurance, that's not really what our intent was, right? So we need to do something about that. And the same is true with Governor Baker with respect to the MBTA control board. Having those conversations with members saying, look, we have some issues here and we need to do some reform, and getting them to support it. So I think members generally have been very good through the years, and a lot of these reforms wouldn't happen were it not for them. But it is difficult because when you go and look at those numbers that not a lot of money, and a lot of it's coming off the top right away, it doesn't leave a lot of room to do a lot of the things that members want to do. So it's it's sort of a give and take with members.
One of the other things we did also is we changed the way we did our public buildings, our courthouses and our schools, so that it's like you can choose. We actually have a central place you can go with designs for them and pick them, so you're not overspending. You have actually professionals who are running the programs there, not municipalities who choose a clerk of the works and build a school that falls down 5 years later. So we put a lot of controls in on those buildings, both for courthouses and for our schools, so that more communities got to build schools than would have before.
Yeah, and one of the key lessons. Oh, sorry, Lieutenant Governor Murray.
Yeah, no, I would just, oftentimes there's a lot of focus on the, palace intrigue and Monday meetings with the big three and teams and staff. But I do think, during that crisis, there was that level of coordination. And I was talking to Secretary Gonzalez, Jay Gonzalez, not too long ago. And, one of the things that during all of this fiscal crisis and with the banks calling in notes and loans, the whole issue of turnpike swapations, swaps coming in and having to deal with that. And he told the story, very vividly, how the Senate president invited him to come in and address the whole the Senate, because of how and why this was important and the financial implications of this. And, nobody wanted to continue to deal with some of the legacy of the big dig debt and things, but it was something that we had to do if we were going to get our fiscal house in order and have a path going forward. So there was without a doubt tremendous, coordination. One of the things, though, too, that in this conversation on how to use the money, both at the municipal level and school level and the federal level, is about how do we look at this through the equity lens? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that the Mass Taxpayer Foundation put in their report that not too long ago around ARPA is, water infrastructure. And if we look, at our gateway cities where commercial tax bases are under duress, there's limited capacity and how much you can pass on on the residential side. I mean, take Worcester. Yes, we've got an economic resurgence and a lot of momentum, but 30% of the pipes here are 100 years old. And there was a time when the federal government, back when the EPA was created, gave 80-90% reimbursements to do those things. That went away in the 80s. So if we think about bond ratings and the overall municipal health of the Commonwealth, not just the state, but our municipalities and those with least ability to pay for it, I think one of the recommendations MTF makes here is let's focus on, some water infrastructure here. And I think the governor and lieutenant governor have talked about that as of others. So I think that is a good long-term, what's underground is not always sexy, the water and sewer, but it's critical to our economy and to our public health as well.
Yeah. And to me, that leads to a great other kind of line of discussion, which is, I see similarities again with municipal health reform, some of the SBA work, where it's about using state resources to kind of unlock stuff that communities can do, right? That if you're freeing up money for them on the municipal healthcare side, they can invest more money. If you're getting that water project over the hurdle, kind of, they can do a little more. And Lieutenant Governor Murray, wondering if you and then everyone else can talk a little bit about, through that equity lens, this idea of disparate impact. Kind of gateway cities weren't totally created as a part of the Great Recession, but they were certainly that was a key vehicle of that time to, I think, try to mitigate disparate impact in certain areas of the state. Can you talk from your perspective in the administration, but also from your perspective in the city of Worcester, about kind of how to think about some of those regional issues, both to kind of address a crisis in the moment and spur ongoing economic recovery and growth?
Well, yeah, and I would argue that it's really kind of doubling down, and again, working with both the Senate President and Brian Dempsey and their colleagues. I mean, we were able to put more money into cleaning up urban brownfield sites, and those are things disproportionately which in our gateway cities, also in some of the older mill towns, and many of those municipalities they don't have the financial ability themselves to do that. So that's where the various brownfield programs are so important. For municipal fiscal health, but also environmental justice issues. I think that's absolutely critical. And then same thing with the housing. And I think the Governor Baker and Lieutenant Governor Polito talking about let's move as quickly as we can on a lot of this housing money. Again, if we're going to convert older office buildings in our gateway cities to housing, or older mill buildings that are not being utilized, those historic tax credits, the low-income tax credits, those programs are absolutely critical to putting deals together that maybe have some units market rate, some affordable. The HDIP program is Housing Development Incentive Program as well. So you have to have those tools. Gateway cities can't do those projects alone. And even some of the smaller mill towns, which exist all across the Commonwealth, don't have the financial capacity on some of those projects as well, without some of those targeted brownfields or other loans. And that's where the Mass Works Infrastructure Program, also maybe expanding that a little bit in terms of what's eligible, could be a tool.
I think that's a great suggestion by the Lieutenant Governor. I think there's no question that Mass Works has been so effective for not only gateway cities, but across the Commonwealth. So there's a real opportunity there. And I think it is that infrastructure, because with that, you get a lot of private investment. And so there's a ripple to this, and it's being strategic about the use of those funds. And, my hope is when you look at cities and towns across the Commonwealth who, as Lieutenant Governor pointed out, also received some assistance, there's an opportunity for them to use those funds, again, infrastructure, doing some local projects, those kinds of things that has, some impact in the economy as well.
Transit-related development, which is a big positive for building, certainly down my way, additional housing next to the train stations and bus stations.
Doug, I would just add to, as you talk about the use of funds, and the Senate President mentioned this very early on in our conversation, which is you got to look at healthcare. There's no question that our hospitals, we have the greatest hospitals in the world here in the Commonwealth. We have a great community hospital systems across the Commonwealth. They need help. Our long-term care facilities need help. Lieutenant Governor talked about housing. I think the Governor, Lieutenant Governor Polito's leadership on that is significant. That creates, economic spin as well. So I think if you look at, this pot of money, and again, they have, some time to use that. It doesn't have to be, and I commend them for taking their time to try to figure out, how to do this correctly and spend it wisely and be prudent. That there's a lot of good things that they can do with that. And I think, the caution to this, though, is, the messaging around this is that this is one-time, funding, and it ought to be separate from the budget, because you don't want to bake in, not only the money, but the expectations, as we know, around some of this stuff. You've got to be careful with that. So I think, I give them all credit for taking a thoughtful approach to this. And I think they're going to come up with something that addresses a number of areas and capitalize on these resources.
And just to follow up on that quickly, because I think it reminds me of something that, Madam President, you and I discussed when we were doing background for this, is that when you're in a crisis like this, it kind of lays bare some issues in the system that always existed, but it makes it even more clear that they do exist. And you made the point at that time and that's why you got to kind of strike while the iron is hot to fix stuff while it's apparent you need to fix it now. And wondering whether it's the healthcare system, the public health system, if you or the Lieutenant Governor can talk about some of the things that you've seen that, geez, we really got to prioritize this area as something to fix.
Well, I think we always knew that we had a problem with our long-term care. That's ongoing, and we have an aging population in the Commonwealth. So I think that's really important to do right now. We always knew Medicaid only pays 70 cents on the dollar. So if you're going in and you have this large volume of people in our extended care facilities, the nursing homes or rehab homes, and they can't get help and they don't pay them a living wage, what's going to happen? Well, we saw that in the crisis. We already had a crisis. This pandemic certainly brought it home. There's got to be a change in the way we provide for our long-term care facilities and the feeder systems from the hospitals themselves, and then and home care. Most people want to stay, if they can, stay in their home. So how do we patch those services and not use it? Take that word away, patch. Let's actually have a system in place where we don't have to patch these services together. If you have somebody that's going in for care, they don't have to scramble and call 10 different agencies to see if they can get a home health care aid before they have to put their loved one in a nursing home. And then what are the protocols and the regulations from Department of Public Health for this? They're putting mentally ill people in their 40s and 50s into nursing homes next to very critically ill people. We have to change the way we do business here.
Yeah, and I would say, one of the other elements of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation report is, suggestion of utilizing some of this, one-time money to assist on the unemployment insurance. And again, it's not always a sexy thing because there's not anything tangible that you can show, but we spend a lot of time in state government talking about sectors that we can grow, companies, big companies that we want to have them come and expand or grow in Massachusetts. But let's remember, it's our small businesses that really drive our city and town and regional economies. And, they've been hit hard during this and through no fault of their own. And so I do think whatever we can do to mitigate some of those unemployment and insurance costs is something that should be given serious consideration going forward as well.
The other issue that we all are very, very well aware of, and certainly, Senate President Spilker, Secretary Sutter's, the mental health issue, and we're just reading today the challenges, across the system. The hope is in so many members of the House, the Senate, and the administration are obviously concerned and want to prioritize this, whether it be the closeout SUP with some of the surplus, whether it be some ARPA funding, whether it be a combination of things. There's an opportunity, hopefully, to put some resources to that as well.
So one thing that just came up, and it relates to a question we have kind of touched on a little bit, is so as you're a policymaker figuring out, in your case, how to cut a lot of money from the budget, in this case, how to spend a lot of money you didn't expect to have. How do you solicit how do you get engagement from other members in the legislature, community feedback, things like that? Can you talk about how you figure out where folks want to go with the money and then kind of corral them, even when you want to make some tough decisions related to something like municipal health care or things like that?
I think you got to get outside your echo chamber. And one of the things that we really did, working with the legislature is, dating back to, when the American Rescue Era, American Reinvestment and Rescue Act dollars came in, is, laws passed and it has to be codified and the regs got to be written and all those things. So there was a lot of speculation of how this money can or cannot be used. And so we put together a task force, I think it was back in 2008, 2009, to go out and solicit from the public, and went around the state to try to understand what they were interested in, the whole thing around shovel-ready projects and getting huge lists of them and various municipal courts, the schools, other types of, infrastructure. So I think you really got to go out and do that hard listening. And I want to, I commend the legislature for doing the hearings as they're doing now. And you want to make sure everyone's heard. And at the end of the day, you got to make a decision. And some people won't be happy with that, but take the time to do that hard listening.
What I found, Doug, is, just sitting with the members, and I know the Senate President did this, both as chair of Ways and Means, but also as Senate President, every budget, it helps shape the priorities because you're listening to, 150, 60 members, not everyone would meet, and you get their priorities and you sort of determine, where you want to put the funding. And, even during the budget process, you're shifting during that budget week based on what you're hearing from members. Members are closest to the electorate. They're talking to their constituents. It really is impactful. And I think that shapes, a lot of the priorities that we see. And I know the same with, the Lieutenant Governor with respect to, releasing House 1 and then House 2. It's basically listening to, folks across the community and members of the House and the Senate.
And the Senate always has it a little bit better because they go first. So we get to see what the governor puts out. You see how the House, what they did. And then we get a third bite at it because the revenue figures are much, much better by the time the Senate gets to do it. Or in the case, unfortunately, in 2009, what we had, the Senate was the one who had to cut $3.5 billion out of our budget from the House budget, which was just traumatic. But it had to be done, and they went along with it because they had already passed their budget, and we had nowhere else to go. And the members, we're all in shock, but the members had to go along with it because the money just wasn't there. And the 9C cuts were. To looking back, I wish we never had to do any of those. We could have kept people working and kept the economy in a better place, but we didn't have the federal funds to back us up.
Yeah. Well, so thank you so much for this conversation. A couple things that I took away from this that are really insightful for me is one, this idea about what are some industries or areas that either through additional investment or just a regulatory structure have the opportunity to kind of take that next level, right? Like life sciences, like the gaming industry. And what are also some of the things we could do to unlock savings at the municipal and other level? You look at municipal finance reform, municipal health reform. I mean, that's a huge thing that wasn't about the state budget, but has saved municipalities billions of dollars over time. And then I really like Chairman Dempsey's point about you can't do everything, right? So whether it's on the fiscal reforms or whether it's on policy initiatives, kind of pick some things that are going to make the biggest impact and then kind of move forward on them. But this has been a phenomenal conversation. Really appreciate it. So thank you all so much for joining. And I guess I would leave it any final words from our panelists of things to note or highlights to take away.
Just one thing we didn't talk a lot about is the environment and the investment in green energy, and that I think is the future for our Commonwealth also.
And that was one area where the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act did give targeted dollars for green, and I think that was something that spawned Massachusetts to be a leader on multiple fronts, and hopefully we can continue to be.
The only point I would make, Doug, is just thinking back through all these years, that we're fortunately have had great leaders, great cabinet secretaries, and as the Lieutenant Governor said earlier, we've all sort of worked together for the betterment of the Commonwealth, which is why the bond rating increased. So I think we've always been sort of mindful of the importance of keeping the Commonwealth fiscally sound and working together to do that. And it continues today in a bipartisan way. And I think that bodes well for the Commonwealth.
Well, thank you all. Great discussion, and thanks everyone for joining. And we'll talk to you again at our next forum. Just we'll say we're planning to do one October 14th to focus on an equitable and inclusive recovery, what that means. Plan to have presentations from scholars from the Boston Fed as well as the Urban Institute. So hopefully everyone can join for that as well. But again, thank you to our panelists, and thanks for everyone to join, and have a great day.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks so much. A lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks.